Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer here with Sofia Condes for season 12. I think we're on episode 4 of the Social Change Career Podcast. Delighted that everyone is joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about careers at the intersection of finance, food, and impact. I will briefly summarize Sofia's bio and then explain how this process works. Sofia is an internationally recognized leader in sustainable development and impact finance at the FAIRR Initiative. She is a driving force in food systems, sustainable finance, and environmental sustainability. Her career over the past decade has included roles at JP Morgan, the World Economic Forum, leading a blended finance program, and managing complex food and nutrition projects in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. She has dual master's degree in development economics and public health, super cool combination, fluency in English, Spanish, and French. And she's the dynamic force on advisory boards of social impact organizations worldwide. So thank you everyone for joining us today. For people who have not been part of a live stream of the Social Change Career Podcast previously, the episode will go about 50 minutes. We love to hear from people where you're watching from, your questions, your comments. So particularly on LinkedIn, feel free to share in the comment section a sentence or two about your work. And then as we go throughout the podcast, your questions and comments or favorite resources. Within about 2 weeks, this will be converted to one of our evergreen podcast episodes. So we have about 120 episodes with innovators and thought leaders from around the world working in all aspects of impact careers, from innovative finance to humanitarian engineering to tech for social change. So the 3 requests before we get started, again, let us know your comments and suggestions. Please check out the podcast and consider rating this episode and or the 120 others. And then please follow FAIRR Initiative, Sofia, and PCDN on LinkedIn. That's the only request. And enjoy the episode, whether you're listening live now or to the podcast episode in the future. I'm joining from PCDN. I'm joining from Medellin, Colombia, and Sofia, you're in London, right? In England.
Yes, pleasure to be here, Craig. Yes. Nice to see you, and yes, joining from London.
Okay. So thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. And so just to start off with, can you summarize the trajectory of your career and how in the world did you find this focus of public health, international development, food, and finance?
Well, yeah, it is a niche area, but I think it's an area that is so important for a lot of the big challenges that we have in the world. And I would say that it's a bit of a journey to get here for me. My career hasn't necessarily been linear. And I didn't start out my career thinking I want to work at the intersection of food and finance. I didn't even know that was a possibility. But eventually, kind of different experiences led me in that direction. And I am kind of really happy for those learnings and to have landed where I am. So maybe if I kind of take a step back to kind of where I started out being a teenager that wanted to be a diplomat for my country, Mexico, or wanted to work at the UN. That was kind of the dream that I had since I was probably like 12 years old. So as soon as I was able to choose what I wanted to study in university, I decided to study international relations and economics because I thought that was the thing that you study to become a diplomat or to work at the UN. And in a way, I almost made my dream true because my first job was as an intern at the UN. But little did I know that those internships were unpaid and that there were actually very few paths to get an entry job at the UN. So I quickly learned that I had to probably start my career somewhere else and maybe eventually come back to the UN or come back to diplomacy. So I was very fortunate I started my bachelor's degree in Mexico, and then eventually I was very fortunate to get the possibility to study a master's degree in Geneva, Switzerland. And that's where I did my internship at the UN. I kind of learned a little bit about the prospects of job opportunities in international development and international diplomacy. And it was a bit challenging to find entry points. So part of the kind of my first steps in my career were honestly kind of a little bit of serendipity. I went to the career fair of my university at the time, the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And there was someone from JP Morgan there that was offering opportunities for careers in banking, which I had never considered. And I kind of spoke to them, and they explained to me that they had a team working on banking in Latin America. It got me interested. So eventually I kind of took their flyer that said, "Do you want to intern at JP Morgan?" Applied for an internship for that summer, really thinking, oh, maybe this is just going to be an internship. And I'm kind of interested in what's happening in what I didn't know how it worked, but I had heard about impact investment, microfinance, and kind of those were like really big topics in this was around 2011. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I should just kind of learn about what a bank does. Surprisingly, I got that internship, and kind of that was the start of my career in mainstream finance. I'm very grateful for that part of my career. I think that working for a large corporation, a bank like JP Morgan, was the perfect school to start your career and to give you like the tools of learning kind of a methodology of work and certain rigor in how you approach work and kind of time management. And obviously gave me tons of technical skills when it came to understanding how the financial sector works. But eventually I knew I didn't want to stay there forever. I wanted to go back to kind of my ambition to have a purposeful job in international cooperation. So after about 3 years, I found a job at the World Economic Forum. And I think that job at the World Economic Forum was the first time that I heard that there were a lot of international projects linked to food systems. I had never heard of the term food system, but I was like, this sounds like something that is interesting and I want to learn more about it. So I started kind of trying to get involved in understanding the work that was happening in food systems, even with the team at World Economic Forum, WEF. And eventually I just was really convinced that I wanted to work in that space. I didn't necessarily know how. But one of the recommendations I received was that I should consider getting a master's in public health, because you cannot work in food if you don't have that kind of public health background to appraise the evidence. I'm not necessarily sure if I would agree with that, but I'm very grateful that I did that, because I definitely feel that that master's degree gave me more credentials to really kind of understand what is real evidence, what is misinformation when it comes to food and health and nutrition. And after that, I was very lucky to get my first job at the intersection of food and finance, working for the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and then kind of have taken on my job at FAIRR for almost 3 years now.
Wonderful. And please, everyone who's watching, we have people from Ghana, Pakistan, Europe, US. Please do check out the organizations, FAIRR, World Economic Forum, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, PCDN. So one question for people who are actually start just basically. So if you think about your academic training, what are some of the core skills that you would say you developed through your undergraduate or master's degrees that have been really useful across your roles? And then what skills have you just learned through professional training or on the job?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's, I guess, a combination of skills that have been really useful from my academic training. I would say economics is helpful. It's been helpful throughout my career, both micro and macroeconomics. I still am very grateful to have kind of good fundamentals of economics. And I think that has been just really helpful for me to, when I started my career in banking, I didn't necessarily have a finance background, but I had enough of an economics background that I could kind of understand the macro concepts and then be able to then link that to specific asset classes and kind of more of the technical financial skills. I would say that when I did my master's in public health, that's when I got very strong skills around kind of how to understand the quality of evidence. I mean, the quality of evidence in the healthcare sector is like at the highest levels, right? Like this is the evidence that will decide if something is basically contributing to poor health, if a medication is actually useful. So that was incredibly helpful, because I feel like that I use that across topics. I know how to understand the difference between a systematic review and the random study that anybody can get published. And that's really helpful. A lot of the other courses I think were intellectually stimulating, but haven't necessarily been kind of as useful hands-on on the job. So I think the skills that I've learned on the job, first, I would say all of my finance background, most of my finance background. I mean, I have done um, some training, some courses, some certifications on finance, impact investing, ESG, but I have learned on the job, and I had to. I mean, I did learn from the best at JP Morgan, but also did require a lot of my personal time and interest to learn those skills. And I'm going to say something maybe slightly controversial, but a skill set that I think is absolutely essential, no matter which job, I've used it everywhere, is having very strong Excel skills, which I thought, who needs Excel? I'm going to be a diplomat. I actually opted out of all Excel classes that I could growing up. I really deeply regretted it because the first time I had my first job and I was an analyst, and everyone at JP Morgan was building macros in Excel, and I could barely survive. I realized that Excel is a tool that is so powerful, and it helps you regardless of the job that you're doing. I mean, maybe if you're a chef, you're not using Excel, but if you're doing an office job, you will use Excel, and if you know how to use it well, it will just make your world so much easier. And I've seen a lot of um, I mean, a lot of colleagues and even people that have worked in my team that came from a background of like, oh, I don't need Excel, and I I've quickly kind of like opened their eyes to like, hey, this is really important, and it's going to just make your job more efficient. And also a lot of the soft skills, right? Which I think are lifelong learning. Presentation skills. How do you actually present to someone in a convincing way? I mean, even basic things such as how do you prepare a PowerPoint that then becomes a very strong pitch deck that if the person that you're trying to influence is a policymaker or a client or I don't know, someone in the investment industry, they're going to look at your presentation and they're going to say this is top quality. It doesn't necessarily matter what the content is, but you're going to present it in a way that is attractive, that is just kind of interesting. And I think that that's really important. And I don't think there's many universities that pay enough attention to some of those presentation skills.
Wonderful. So I'll make a quick plug. Our guest next week is going to be Sahil Patni from Unreasonable Group, who in the past was a consultant to PCN. And we weren't actually looking for a consultant. And he came from the finance and the management consulting world. And we met him at a career fair, Society for International Development. And he was like an on and off part-time consultant for PCN for years, but he has had a huge impact career. He's, Unreasonable is one of the world's leading impact investor groups. But when he first started working with us, a lot of it was just like building out these incredible Excel dashboards. We'd be like, we need something like this. And he'd help us figure out what do we think we need and just turn it into dashboards and systems that we could use like up for the long term. So I agree, like knowing how to, whether it's Notion or Excel or knowing how to build dashboards and data and visualizations that can be used for the long term is such a valuable skill set. Even in the age of AI, like there's a lot now you can do in Google Bard or, with AI and Excel, which makes it easier, but still understanding how to do those things is such a huge asset. And not enough people know.
Absolutely. And that's why I think sometimes some of these jobs that are like, for example, I mean, management consulting or banking analysts are so helpful at the start of your career because they give you some of those really kind of hard skills that end up being useful throughout your career.
So a question if someone comes to you, let's say a younger aspiring professional, and they're thinking about graduate school or working for a startup or working for, multilateral or a bank, how do you help guide people who say obviously everyone has to make the right choice based on their country, their economic circumstances, the job market. But how do you advise people? Like, is it better to work for a startup where you can learn all these things, whether the startup succeeds or not, you're going to learn so much? Or is it better to go work for a traditional consulting group or bank? Or if you're pursuing a master's degree, what's your advice about how to decide on the right program for that person and potentially also how to land a scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you say that, it really depends on the person. So I usually, more than being prescriptive, I ask them a lot of questions. Like, are you a very organized person? Because if you're already like really organized, maybe then and you're kind of like, oh, I love data, I'm very organized, I've been self-taught on kind of all of these processes, I already know how to do all these things. Then it's like, okay, maybe you're ready to work in a startup. But if you're not necessarily someone that, I mean, let's say if you study social sciences, maybe you didn't have those learnings around like data and I mean Excel and kind of all of these things that are very useful to structure and make your work more efficient. So I would almost recommend them, well, if you can, like, think about a starting job in a place that already has structure, and that will kind of like give you like a standard of like how to make sure your work is super efficient, super organized. Because if you start in a startup or an NGO, there is no structure. You'll have to build it yourself. So are you the kind of person that already has that structure, or are you the kind of person that needs kind of to learn from a top down structure, and then you will kind of like, okay, get it and use that everywhere, anywhere else that you can. As for graduate school, I think it really depends what you want to do. I mean, I think that coming from kind of the global south or a low middle income country, if you can get a scholarship and have a work experience outside of your home country, there will be so many doors that will open up that will be very difficult to open if you don't take that graduate school kind of opening. It's kind of like a key that opens other doors, right? Like, I've had many people that thought it was impossible for them to work in Europe because they didn't have the passport, they didn't have the contacts, and then by being able to come to Europe, do a master's degree, get an initial network of your own peers, of your university, of alumni, then you kind of like go to career fairs. I mean, just like what I explained, right? I had no contacts when I arrived in Switzerland, and neither did most of my colleagues coming from Brazil or also from Mexico or from India. And we all leveraged that first network to get our first internship that then got us hired. And then we've all been able to kind of build our careers outside of our home country. Some of us with the idea of like, oh, eventually I'll go back to my home country. But some of us, then life happens and you change. But without graduate school, that would have been really challenging. And I also think, depending on what you want to do, I think there's a lot of kind of business jobs that don't necessarily require a kind of a master's degree. But if you want to become an expert in a field, let's say your passion is, I want to work in environmental sustainability. I mean, there's just so much to learn, right? Things are moving so fast. So I would say it will be challenging for you to really be an expert with just a bachelor's degree. So do go ahead and make sure you can get as prepared as you can.
Wonderful. And I also lived in Europe many years. I mean, obviously I have a US passport. Now I've been in Colombia 6 years, but just to put in a plug, if you think about the sector that you're passionate about, whether it's innovative finance or tech or gender, economic development, but then also if you think about a region, and this is not always the right choice, but I did my master's at Central European University, lots of fellowships. By the way, their deadline for fellowships is tomorrow. They're not paying for this, but it's a great program. But if you find like both the sector and a region, it can open more opportunities depending, it might just be the sector, but, and I was able to get a visa sponsored in the UK. I moved there, it wasn't the right job, so I quit. But, often if you built the networks, of course, immigration is insanely hard in so many places in the world. So I don't want to say if you do a degree in the UK or Geneva or France, you're magically going to get a job there. Every place is different. But, if you have that sectoral and geographic focus and picking the right programs, it could help, particularly if you're fortunate enough to get a fellowship.
Absolutely. And I would say that, I mean, it is very challenging, but your probabilities of getting that sponsorship for a visa are much higher if you've already studied in that country and have had an internship in that country, or people know, oh, I know this university. So if you have access to that, again, there's no one path. And I know that it is those scholarships are very competitive, but it definitely can help if you get there.
Okay. Yeah. And again, that my one caution would be, and I still teach, not full-time anymore, is obviously don't assume if you do go to a school, in any country and you don't get funding and you take on a huge amount of debt, don't assume you're going to get a job in that country to be able to pay off the debt. Like I've seen people take out very expensive degree programs, particularly the US and UK tend to be more expensive, but not only. And assuming, oh, it doesn't matter if I have $80,000 or euros in debt because I'll get a job in that country. That's, make sure you calculate that as well. I know lots of people who've gotten a job, paid it off, but it's not guaranteed. So the next question is, so what in the world is food sustainability and finance? So can you talk about like what are what's happening in that sector? Because obviously we all need to eat, and people like food, water, shelter, health, and education are basic needs. And a lot of people, when they think about development or innovative finance, it's like food seems to be more like, okay, it's something that farmers do. There's big agriculture. So what is this sector? What are the type of roles that people pursue in it, and what are you specifically doing in the sector?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question that I often get asked, even when I'm explaining what I do at a dinner table. So basically, well, the food sector is more than just food, or is more than just agriculture, right? When you think about the food value chain, the production of food, so either whether it is a farmer and then kind of an aggregator, all the way downstream to the consumer, involves many different agents. So you have the companies that manufacture the food, you have the companies that are actually the supermarket chains, you have the restaurant chains, and then at different levels, depending on the country that you are, those companies have kind of different needs and different roles to play. And why I'm focusing on that sector is because this is a sector that was kind of very much neglected by the finance community for a long time. I mean, there's tons of evidence of the fact that there's been a lack of access to finance in low and middle income countries, for farmers, but also for companies in the food value chain, which means that there hasn't necessarily, that explains part of the problem of kind of lack of diversity to lack of access to a diverse set of foods, which also explains some of the malnutrition challenges that we have in low and middle income countries. But I think also beyond that, this was a sector that hadn't necessarily seen as much innovation and disruption as other sectors. And I think even from a climate and environmental perspective, initially there was so much focus on sectors such as energy or transport, but not enough in food. That has drastically changed in the last, I would say, 7 years, but I think probably the last 3 years have been instrumental in the investment community realizing that the food sector as a whole can be not only a sector that is ready for innovation, but also a sector that if you want to have huge impact, is a sector that you should pay attention to. Why? Because we can't reach the Paris Agreement goals if we don't make our food system more sustainable. Why? Because it is currently the number one driver of the burden of disease. And also because it's a sector, as I mentioned, that if you find kind of some of those solutions and innovations, you can actually support companies that will do really well by actually kind of providing a solution to some of the environmental and social challenges. So what I do in this space, and which is the model of FAIRR, is that we basically try to explain to investors, and by investors I mean mainstream investors. So for example, large institutional pension funds, asset managers from all over the world, why they should be paying more attention to the food system as a whole, and what are some of the risks in the sector and some of the opportunities. So to explain, for example, what I mean by risks is companies that are really high emitters. So they have really high levels of emissions. And in a world where we are increasingly recognizing that we all need to reduce our emissions, if you have those types of companies as an investor in your portfolio, and those companies don't have a plan of transitioning and reducing their emissions, that's a huge risk, right? But they won't be able to operate in the same way in the future. What are the opportunities? The opportunities are some of those innovations. What are the companies that are actually offering more sustainable foods, that are offering healthier options? And how do you make sure that as an investor, you're actually allocating your capital, considering those risks and opportunities? So that's a lot of the work that I do at FAIRR, is kind of like raising awareness of those risks and opportunities within the investment community, and also encouraging investors to use their influence to encourage companies to actually improve their practices across kind of several environmental, social, and governance issues.
So wonderful. I was just on mute. So really fascinating. So a couple of kind of metric questions and then like career questions. And again, feel free, people who are watching, we've got lots of people around the world, to put your comments, let us know where you're watching from. So first of all, you talked about kind of net carbon emissions or climate, negative climate impact. So what is some, like, let's say, I mean, I'm a small scale investor, I'm not an institutional investor, but we do angel investing. So let's say you're talking to someone, whether they're investing their own retirement or they're representing a large institutional investor like Vanguard or a bank or multilateral or a pension fund. What is some of your data that you'd like to cite about the negative impact of not considering the climate and human aspect of agriculture? That some key negative data points, like, hey, this is serious. And then what are some of your kind of more positive data points about, hey, if we live in Colombia, obviously the Amazon, particularly between Colombia and Brazil, deforestation is a huge issue. A lot of deforestation has to do with agricultural output, whether it's palm oil or cattle or other things. So like, what are both like the depressing facts that you most frequently cite to convince institutional or individual investors this is important to think about, and some of the things that can show if these things are actually integrated, not just greenwashed, there could be much better climate and sustainability impact?
Yeah, so I think maybe on kind of the depressing issues, let's start there. The depressing issues. So the food system as a whole is responsible for 1/3 of global emissions. So that means that even if today we phased out fossil fuels, imagine like all the excitement that we would have, right? Oh, we phased out fossil fuels, but the food sector continues in the same trajectory, we would still get above 1.5 degrees. So basically, there's no getting there's no limiting the rising of temperatures to 1.5 degrees without a real transition in the food sector. Then to your point on biodiversity, the food sector, food and agriculture is the number one driver of biodiversity loss. And basically food for animals, and specifically cattle ranching, is the number one driver of deforestation loss, right? So basically deforestation loss is coming from three main commodities in the world. It's coming from beef, it's coming from palm oil, and it's coming from soy. So those are three commodities that are really driving most of the deforestation that we see in the world. So again, we're not going to solve the big challenges that we have from a biodiversity standpoint unless we really solve how to, well, first produce food in a way that is more sustainable, but also really reconsider the diets that we have, especially in high-income countries where we're eating too much, for example, red meat. And then if we would reduce some of that, there will be a huge systemic impact. And then maybe the third stat, which is less well known, is that the production of animals for food is basically producing that amount of animals for food requires an immense amount of antibiotics. So 70% of antibiotics worldwide are not given to humans, are given to animals for food production. And antimicrobial resistance is one of the rising challenges of our time, because if we lose antibiotics, we lose modern medicine. So we really need to rethink, how are we going to continue with diets in the way that they are now, with that production of intensively farmed animals consuming such an amount of antibiotics, not necessarily for treating disease, but for an irresponsible use, for example, for growth promotion, which means animals grow faster if you give them small doses of antibiotics, and also for prevention of disease, because they are so confined that you just give antibiotics to animals all the time just to prevent disease. So I think those are three stats that kind of show the systemic risks in the current system. In terms of the opportunities, I mean, there are huge opportunities. there's a lot of work that is happening right now in making sure that we have food technologies that allow us to consume foods that don't necessarily rely as heavily on animals. And I think that, there's been in so many countries, right? A lot of work already done at we hear a lot about these big companies like Impossible Foods, but I've been working, throughout my career with lots of interesting small, medium enterprises in Nigeria or in Mexico that are doing kind of their own innovative foods for their market. So I think lots of interesting and kind of positive innovations there. And also, I think now there's like tons of work around what are the climate technologies that will reduce that huge impact that food production has today on the environment and on climate, and to make sure that those technologies have the right finance, because a technology without the right financing is just an idea, right? Like you need the finance to get it out in the market, to make it scalable, to make it efficient. And maybe I would also say some of the innovations and the things that are positive that we're seeing in the food sector are not necessarily just kind of high tech. Sometimes it's going back to basics. So, for example, regenerative agriculture approaches are now really interesting for investors, because if you look at the sector and you would work in a way that you have a full circle and it is able to capture carbon and also preserve biodiversity and promote biodiversity, this is a sector where investors would actually say, like, I can invest in this sector, reduce my environmental footprint, capture carbon, promote biodiversity, all those like really high priority ticks like that you want to see, they are there. So I think there's a lot of really challenging issues that have a negative impact due to the food sector's operations as they are today. But I'm very positive to see lots of innovations, especially in the last 5 years.
Okay, wonderful. One quick story, and I can ask a million questions, but some are starting to come in. But South by Southwest, I haven't been in a few years, but Catalina, who I work with, and my wife got an award maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And so I've been a bunch of times. And, speaking of, Mexico often has a big group of entrepreneurs exhibiting, with support, I think, from the government or business. And, one of the things I tried for the first time, grasshopper chips, and it's like in my mind, I'm like, that's gross, but like I tried it, tasted, like it was really interesting. And like there, again, you have to think about the ethics of killing grasshoppers to make chips, but there's all sorts of interesting experimentation going on in the world. So the next question is from Nikita. Nikita, let us know where you're from in terms of, but thanks for the question. As we're aware, meat production accounts for about 60% of greenhouse emissions. What do you think of plant-based foods as an alternative to work in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And you also mentioned that soy, I think, was the third largest contributor to deforestation. So, if you can address Nikita's question, but also keep in mind, you talked soy and palm oil, because those are both big factors, at least in mass production of vegetarian options and also just industrial food.
Yeah, no, and thank you for the question. I do want to make sure I clarify that more than 70% of the soy produced in the world is not for human consumption, is to be fed to animals. So it's basically kind of part of the same issue of we are producing way too many animals. And in some regions of the world, our diets are too meat intensive. And that is like accounts for a huge part of the environmental footprint that the food sector has today. So I do think that plant-based diets have a role to play, and some of the plant-based alternatives have a huge role to play. What the shape and form that those alternatives take are very different in different countries, right? So again, when I was working more in the impact investment side, I visited several companies, in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in Tanzania, in Kenya, that were producing plant-based foods that were fortified with vitamins and minerals, and they were amazing. And sometimes it was, for example, there's a company that in Kenya that produces beans, but beans in a way that is like very easy to cook. And those beans are kind of iron-rich beans. So they're beans that have been biofortified with iron. That's a plant-based food that I see as like a hugely innovative, because it just basically reduces the difficulty of cooking beans. It makes them much more nutritious, etc. So for me, that's a solution. It doesn't necessarily have to be just cellular meat. Cellular meat might be a solution in very high income markets in the near future. But even, for example, companies like Oatly, right? When people kind of question my arguments and say like, oh, but do you really think that people are going to change their diets? I'm like, well, I mean, the percentage of consumption of plant-based milks in the UK is now, I mean, I think in the age ranges of less than 40 years old is almost 40%. 15 years ago, that was close to zero. Like, honestly, only the people that had like a lactose intolerant would consume those milks. So there are changes that are happening and that we already see in the market, but those changes will take different shapes and forms in different contexts. And there's not a one solution that is kind of like, oh, this is the only type of plant-based alternative and it's going to be sold everywhere. I don't really believe in that. I think that there's a lot of innovation that has to happen kind of bottom up. Other companies, for example, a Nigerian company, Veggie Victory, that it produces like a plant-based meat, but that is made like kind of a stew meat. So you can add it to stew, which is more like a way that this meat is consumed in Nigeria, but is actually made of wheat and soy protein. And I think those are the solutions of tomorrow, right?
Thanks, Nikita. I'm glad to hear you're working on a bachelor's in food technology. So obviously you're going to have a lot to contribute or already have. So an ethical question, I don't want to call any particular institution, but a lot of people would say the current form of capital, the way capital is invested in the world, most large institutions are still prioritizing, and wealthy people or pension funds are prioritizing maximum return for their stakeholders, understandably so, and that a lot of the maximum return still is based on food that is fundamentally destructive for the planet and for people. And that, how do you balance the need for returns? And again, and maybe you don't necessarily have to answer this, but that, if you think of McDonald's, and I don't want to call out, let's think of fast food. I don't want to call it a specific company, but a lot of fast food companies, yes, they're trying to pivot to some degree on the margins, but fundamentally their food products and the need to produce mass food that's often produced with ingredients that are unhealthy and packaging that's unhealthy, that's transported that's unhealthy, to keep it at a price point that consumers will buy it. Like, it's very hard to do that in a way that's sustainable for people on the planet. And a lot of capital is going to institutions and companies that are producing and marketing. And so how do you balance like this? There's so much capital in the world, and a lot of the change of capital is still to sustainability, still in the margins. So and it's not really, I'll just say, like, as an investor, both, I teach on this, and as an angel investor, when I look at public market, publicly traded companies, it's different in the private markets. Every company that I look at, particularly when I think about sustainability, I haven't found a single food company that I think is truly regenerative and triple bottom line. That's at a big market level. Small scale, yes. And so, like, how do you balance that kind of tension between institutions and people need to have returns, but so much of the food industry is kind of challenging? And again, like, if you prefer to pass, that's fine. It might be too much of a kind of existential question, but how do you think about that or influence it, or what's the magic tipping point of how to get more capital to truly regenerative, sustainable, good for people and planet?
I think that I do agree with everything you've said, and I think it's a question that has many layers, and I've tried to grapple with it throughout my career, because I do agree. There's still a lot of the capital that is basically encouraging the same practices that we know are leading us to all of this, like environmental degradation, social issues, etc. I think that there's not one solution to this issue, right? There's no silver bullet. There's a set of complementary solutions happening in parallel that will help us get out of a little bit of the mess that we're in. So part of it is supporting those companies that are kind of impact first, and the ones that are like the innovators, like the company, like, I mean, BNC that I mentioned in Kenya, Veggie Victory in Nigeria. There's tons of companies in Latin America that I always say, like, if I was kind of like just born with wealth and had my own family office, I would be dedicating like all the money I could to those companies, because those companies have a really hard time getting the right funding, the patient capital they need. So that's a lot of what can happen kind of from an impact investment standpoint. Then, but not every investor can be impact first. And I think that's something that we also kind of need to acknowledge, because I think there's a lot of, for example, pension funds have a fiduciary duty, right? They are there to make sure that in 20 years, you will have your pension and they haven't lost money. So that risk tolerance, I mean, they just can't take some of those big risks. They need to kind of invest in some of those very well-established companies that they know, like, kind of will keep growing and will keep being very profitable. So that's, I think, why I now, I mean, I kind of started in the impact investing space, supporting like those innovators or almost impact first companies. But I would always say as well, like, if a company just focus on impact and is never going to be profitable, then that's not a good company, because at one point the company needs to stand on its own 2 feet. And philanthropic capital, I mean, there's tons of other causes that are purely philanthropic. So you won't be able to continue that journey unless at one point in time you have a business model. That's why there's tons of impactful ideas, but that are not sustainable in the long term, because you need to find a way to kind of achieve that impact, but also have a business model. And that will mean at some point you will have to make some sacrifices, and there will things that you would love to do with your heart, but you cannot necessarily do as a business. And then there's another big part of kind of this systemic issues that we have, which is, how do we make sure we change, at least move the needle in terms of the practices of those massive companies that have an impact of billions on consumers, and that purchase, at times they're the biggest purchasers of some of the commodities that we know are driving deforestation, climate change, etc. If we make their practices not perfect, because perfect, that's not going to be, like, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. But let's say if a company like McDonald's that you mentioned changes some of its policies, it literally has an impact in the whole supply chain of beef. So I wouldn't dismiss the impact that you can make by small incremental changes in those massive players. So I do still think that there's a role to be played there. And then finally, there's a role for government money. There's tons of public money that is going into subsidies that are financing those same practices, right? There's tons of public money that is going to development finance institutions that are not necessarily taking those kind of like risks that we would love to see them take, or that are not necessarily kind of filling in the catalytic capital role. So I think there's different players that need to make different changes, and there's not kind of just black or white.
Okay. Yeah, it's very complex. So this leads perfectly to the next question from Suleika. Let us know where you're watching from. She is planning to start a sustainable food company. I think she asked the previous question about millet, how to put more millet into mainstream food and snacks. So any thoughts about how to make the supply chain and production either as sustainable as possible, or, so both from your work with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and with FAIRR, any advice for people who are building companies or, ecosystems, and what to consider, what to avoid, or how to be as kind of net positive as possible?
Yeah. Well, thank you. So I would say maybe my definition of sustainability would be kind of quite broad. So I would, again, I'm not an entrepreneur myself, so there's many other people that can give more hands-on advice. But I would say, let's make sure that you know who your potential consumers are, and then make sure that you're filling in a niche. Like, what are other options in the market that are less sustainable, and what do you want to see different? And sustainability sometimes can mean a better ingredient. So millet, for example, is like one of the foods of the future. So you're already starting in the right place, but sometimes it can be again, substituting like one of those ingredients that we've mentioned before that are, we know, have a very high environmental impact for an ingredient that has less environmental impact. It can also be thinking about your packaging. What if instead of using plastic, you use, I don't know, cardboard or paper, or there's different alternatives. And also social sustainability. Maybe you're thinking of millet, and millet on its own is already quite nutritious, but what about thinking about fortifying that millet and making sure it has more vitamins and minerals, and then you're having a much more important impact in the health and nutrition of your consumers. So yeah, think about it holistically, but make sure you know who your potential consumers are and that you have a very clear business plan. I think the business plan is the kind of like the skeleton of any good company, no matter how good your idea.
Okay, wonderful. And we have a friend who has a coffee farm. I mean, worked in development for many years and has a coffee farm with their partner. And they're trying to pay living wages, good wage, but also their packaging. It's totally different type of packaging, because a lot of coffee packaging, they're trying not to use chemicals, but their packaging is like paper. Like, I think it's biodegradable, versus like a lot of coffee comes like in plastic or things that are really hard to work with. So we have about 5 more minutes. So Kathleen's readings from Denver is interested in learning more about impact consulting and about the conversations around sustainability. So that's a big question, but to kind of make it more focused, let's say for people who want to work on the consulting end, whether it's for a big consulting firm or like Bridgespan or FSG or any of the ones, like what is your advice for people wanting to work on impact and sustainability consulting?
So I mean, I think there's like that is a sector that is really growing, because lots of companies throughout the world are grappling to, how do I make my business model more sustainable? How do I think about really kind of more disclosure of my emissions? How do I make sure I have more traceability of my supply chain? So they need consultants to do that. They are not necessarily going to hire kind of like full-time staff just for each of those things, because if there's consultants that are doing this for multiple companies, they can leverage that. So I would just think that's a very interesting and kind of high growth area to focus your career on.
Thank you so much. And Benjamin, yes, all the podcasts are recorded, so you can watch this live stream on YouTube or LinkedIn. And then within 2 weeks, there'll be an episode of the Social Change Career Podcast, which you can get on PCN or any major podcasting platform. Mohammed just making a comment. If we could kind of reduce bureaucracy, then it'd be much more nimble. So I guess a couple of questions, before we start to wrap up, or as we start to wrap up. What, for people who are thinking about this intersection of sustainability, impact, food, and finance, any growth areas you see in terms of the careers, whether someone wants to start their own thing or work for a multilateral, bilateral, and like, where would you recommend people look the most? Was it the FAO, the World Food Program? I mean, Rockefeller Foundation is doing a lot. So where do you recommend, both in terms of like, what are the career paths that are likely to grow, and where to look for, for those opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're good at and what you want to do. Like, there's huge demand for really good food technologies, right? And that's an avenue. There's demand for people that have a private sector experience and want to work at the FAO or at the World Food Program, because usually those kind of UN organizations were mainly staffed by people that didn't really deal with the private sector. And I think there's an increasing recognition that we can't just sit around and wait for governments and UN agencies to solve all problems. There's going to be like much more collaboration happening with the private sector, with the investment industry, etc. So I think if you have experience in the private sector and you're kind of looking to have an impact, and more impact than you can do now in the private sector, there's huge opportunities. And I would say also maybe skills that I have seen are hugely important in this space is good fundraising skills. So think, if you're someone that has worked in sales or that has any type of experience and you're really good at talking to people, explaining why this matters, and what is kind of like, why should they pay attention to this, and why is this a solution? You're a good influencer. and you can actually kind of come up with a good fundraising strategy, there will always be jobs for you. So and yeah, I mean, beyond, I guess, what we've said before, like presentation skills, public speaking, and just being a good networker, that always helps regardless of the path that you choose.
Okay. And last two quick questions as we wrap up. So where do you go for the news or the funding opportunities or the interesting companies? Like what network or conference or listserv, or for people who are like really interested in what you're talking about, like where do you go for like the inspiration, the jobs, the funding, the cool companies?
Yeah. So I would say we have a newsletter at FAIRR. So if you want to learn more about the work that we're doing with companies and some of this content, do subscribe to it. But besides that, I think that I do follow some of those organizations that you mentioned, like Rockefeller Foundation. I think is doing amazing work. I do also follow kind of some of the networks of impact investors, ESG finance. So I do subscribe to, for example, Responsible Investor, and kind of read their newsletter, like, well, their weekly emails, to see kind of what are the priorities in the space. Is really important to keep up to date. And for those more in the development space, I think DevX is a really good resource, and there's tons of job listings there. So I would encourage you to look there.
The last question, nothing to do with work. Is there a podcast, a book, a movie, show that you have enjoyed recently that just you would recommend others check out? Whether it doesn't have to have anything to do with impact, but just kind of occupying your brain.
Oh, that's an interesting one. So maybe on books linked to the food system, I recently read a book that is called Ravenous. I don't know if it's written by Henry Dimbleby. He's a very interesting guy. He is an entrepreneur. He started a food company called Leon, but now he's doing tons of work in the food system. And I think that's a really good book that kind of sets where we are in food and where we should be going.
Okay.
So I highly recommend it.
Okay, thank you so much for your time, wisdom, and energy, and everybody for watching and your questions. And please, you can watch this on YouTube or LinkedIn. The podcast episode will be out in about 2 weeks. And please follow Sofia on LinkedIn, FAIRR, PCDN, and have a wonderful afternoon, morning, or evening, wherever you are. So thank you so much again, Sofia.
Thank you for your time, Craig. Pleasure to speak to you.
Okay.